Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Ian and Claudia, for inviting TalkWorks to be with you this afternoon. I think you're so right. The challenges and some of the biggest challenges that continue to face us in these days are those of connectivity, and hopefully we'll be able to shed a little bit of light as we go through the presentation today as to how we might equip ourselves best to meet those challenges. Because as Claudia will just show us on the next slide, at TalkWorks, what we tend to do on a daily basis is we work with a variety of organisations across the North East to provide psychological services aimed at improving the quality of our mental health and well-being through a range of therapy and training, sleep consultations, psychological MOTs. But whichever part of our work we're carrying out and whatever our particular role within TalkWorks, every one of us is united by the following beliefs that appear on the screen now. And these beliefs that'll just appear really can be summarized in the very fact that if we can take care of ourselves by knowing ourselves well, we can take care of others by knowing them better. And the research tells us that where we do that, we're more efficient and we're more productive, so it makes good financial sense. But what we actually know is that by knowing and taking care of ourselves and others, it's the right and it's the human thing to do. And the changes that have been thrust at us as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic are certainly providing us with both opportunities and challenges as to how we know and care for ourselves better. We don't really get a choice in engaging with that because the challenge is real and it's active and it's here. And one of the metaphors that we will often use when we are working therapeutically or clinically is to use this image of the waves. The nature of the COVID-19 wave impacts every aspect of our life as it relates to our relationships, our personal and our professional lives. The waves it's presented us with are certainly unprecedented and we can't stop them. So our job is to learn to surf. Now, I have really mixed emotions with this analogy, having tried surfing once on Manly Beach, and in my head, I thought I'd look exactly like the picture that you can see on the screen. In reality, I think I swallowed more water than was in the sea to start with. And to be honest, the lump on my head from the board that ended up on top of me rather than below my feet wasn't quite the testament to my surfing abilities that I had hoped for. I spent 20 minutes trying to even join the group out back, which I thought was somewhere in a desert, but clearly exists somewhere in the ocean. And when I finally did manage to join them, I ended up just worrying about whether I'd ever make it back to shore. So I am delighted that this afternoon I'm in safer territory, looking at how we equip ourselves to deal with the challenges that are provided to us from a psychological perspective. Because as we've said, the nature of COVID-19 impacts on every element of our human being. And we can see on this next slide that part of just being human means that, and for those of you familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, you'll recognize the part on the left perhaps as being a really foundational block for how we build therapy. And for us this afternoon, I want to use it as a foundational block for how we build our response to COVID-19, because the impact of COVID-19 challenges us physically, it challenges us in our behavior, in our thinking style, and it challenges us emotionally. Because ultimately, the challenge takes us to a place, to use Barry Mason's model, where we feel both unsafe and uncertain. And whilst we're instinctively drawn to seek out safe certainty, the reality of our current circumstance means that these are uncertain times. And so combining these two models, a psychological response has to equip us to feel safe enough to deal with the uncertainties in each of the four areas. So let's begin by considering how we can re-establish, firstly, a physical sense of safety. It's really important that we always begin with the physical, because the very nature of our humanity, we need to grapple with the animal of us. And so it might seem a bit dramatic to consider how we re-establish physical sense of safety, but it isn't when we consider the impact that the current climate and our current challenges are having on our brain. I have to do the brain really simply. So if you all, just wherever we are this afternoon, if we all just clench our fists in front of us, do no damage, but just clench our fists for ourselves, and we consider that the oldest part of our brain sits where our thumb is currently housed, beneath our fingers there. Now, that thumb, as we have it, this part of the brain houses the amygdala, and this is the part of our brain which scans for danger. It's alert to any potential threat. And when it detects it, its role is to essentially press the alarm button, to flood the body with adrenaline and cortisol, releasing our fight, flight, freeze, appease mechanism. And it has a better safe than sorry approach. So it will always pick up on the potential threat more clearly than it will let anything go. But when it triggers this alarm button, what happens to the outer bit of the brain, our fingers grasped around our thumb, if you're still clenching your fist at the moment, what happens to this outer bit of the brain, the bit of our brain that does our reasoning, our reflecting, our rationalizing, is essentially it drowns out with the noise of the alarm. If we imagine using this metaphor, it drowns out with the noise of the alarm our ability to do those things that so often we take for granted. It drowns out our ability to think and reason and reflect in a way in which we ordinarily would. And so all of those ways in which we need to be able to respond to crisis, to challenge, become at best difficult and at worst, or perhaps more likely, impossible. It's like having too many tabs open on our computers, or too many people trying to log into a particular network at a certain point. It becomes clunky. And so our first challenge then means that in current circumstances, our brain will detect them because of the uncertainty as a potential threat. And for us to be able to grapple with our response to it, we need to be able to find a way to soothe our amygdala, to stop it producing so much adrenaline and cortisol, to use up some of the surplus that we have, which we will experience as those feelings of worry and of anxiety. So how do we do this? Well, let's consider it. Firstly, adrenaline and cortisol doesn't have an off switch. It needs using up. So taking advantage of our 1 hour a day potential walk time, or using the exercise programs in our homes, whether that's an excuse to use Joe Wicks with the kids, or whether it's an excuse to log on to some of the NHS websites that have provided some exercises that we can do at home, or going as far as joining Olympic athletes in terms of Dame Kelly Holmes and what she's putting on. Using up adrenaline cortisol becomes important. We need to make use of the space that we have available to us to engage in physical activity. But we also need to reduce the amount that's being produced in the first place. And this is where we go right back to basics. So I'm just going to encourage you now just to take a breath for me. So just breathe in and breathe out. Let's just do a couple more. Breathing in and breathing out. And I just want you to notice, and if you want to note it down in the chat, the chat box there, which part of your body was moving the most when you took your breaths just then? Was it the shoulders? Was it the stomach? Now I'm going to hazard a guess for many of us this afternoon, it was possibly we noticed a movement around our chest area and around our shoulder area. Because what our research shows us is that as adults, and this is brilliant to see the responses coming in, chest and shoulders, yeah. Now this makes loads of sense given the times that we're living in, because when we breathe from our chest, from our upper body, we're breathing in the way that we would breathe when we run away, say from the woolly mammoth back in the day, but we run and we breathe from the chest area. What this does is it sends a message to the brain that says we're in danger, send more adrenaline cortisol. So we're constantly pumping our body with this sense that we then experience as this feeling of anxiety. So what's happening then is when we face challenge and when we face uncertainty, and it's perceived by the brain as being unsafe, and then when we perceive it by the brain to be unsafe, the adrenaline is released into the body. And then we will notice that our breathing becomes shallower. And equally, by breathing more shallowly, we're sending a message back to the brain that says, keep sending the adrenaline cortisol. For those of us who've seen babies sleeping, we'll know that when they sleep and when they breathe, it's their tummies that go up and down. And that's what we need to get back to. Because when we breathe from the tummy, diaphragmatic breathing, belly breathing, whatever we would like to call it, when we breathe from the stomach, this is when we send the opposite message to the brain that says, at ease. Essentially, amygdala, stand down. Don't send us as much adrenaline and cortisol. And if we can do that, if we can stop that production, then we free up, remember those fingers clenched around our thumb, then we can free up that outer part of the brain to be able to think more clearly about the situation we find ourselves in. So let's just try it. This point in the afternoon, if we place our fingers and our hands across our stomach, so our fingertips are touching. I'm imagining we're all doing this right now. So our fingertips are touching across our stomach, and we're just going to take a breath in. And as we breathe in, we're going to push the fingertips away from each other. So we send the fingertips further away. And then as we release the breath, the fingertips come back to join each other again. One more time. Breathing in, so we push the fingertips away. And breathing out, so our fingertips come back to join. Now this can seem really simple, and perhaps we're really disappointed already that, hang on, one of our first tools in our toolkit is about breathing. We do it every day. But if we don't get it right every day, then the danger is that we add to our sense of alertness and our sense of anxiety. And at times like this, we need to really be bringing down, de-escalating that sense of nervousness that we get. Because the nervousness is just the term that we've put to too much adrenaline, too much cortisol in the body for our needs. So the first tool in our toolkit is to get back to diaphragmatic breathing and to practice that just as much as we engage in regular exercise, taking the opportunities that we have still available to us. We breathe. We make a real prescriptive effort to breathe from the diaphragm. And another way that we can actually get in the back door to free up our brain to be able to think is again through our body. Progressive muscle relaxation, for those of you familiar with perhaps yoga, you may well be very familiar with this technique, but essentially we don't even need to do it progressively at this stage. What it relies on is us tensing every muscle in our body, from our toes through our calves, thighs, arms, shoulders, face, tensing it all, holding it so we can really feel it, so it shakes just that certain extent, and then releasing it. So we tense everything right through the body, holding it so that we can feel it shaking, and then releasing it. Now, if we can combine it, I'm all for making as many pronged attacks as we can when it comes to improving our mental health and well-being. If we can combine it with some diaphragmatic breathing, so that as we tense everything, we breathe in, a big belly breath, pushing our stomach away, hold, and release. And I'm sure that sounds really strange at the other end of your computer screens right now, but it's based in really good physiology, because what we know about a muscle is that when we tense it and then when we release it, it will expand further than it was to start with. And that expansion is what we have then given the name feeling more relaxed to. It's a physical representation of what we've then termed relaxation. In the same way that anxiety or worry is that emotion word that we've given to the presence of too much adrenaline and cortisol in the body. So first, two tools for our toolkit. How do we start to meet the challenges provided to us by COVID-19? We come back to soothing the amygdala, turning the alarm down so that we can start to engage with our behaviors. That's where we'll come to next. And the two crucial ways we can do it is coming back to our breathing, fundamental of course to us, and also using our muscles to get on our side and to be able to create a sensation for ourselves of relaxation so that we can then feel more equipped, safer to meet the challenges presented in the uncertainty in which we live. Because the way that we're wired as humans means we must start with a physical intervention. And when we've come back to ourselves, to our own bodies, then we can start to focus on our behaviours. So our next section of this afternoon is about how do we re-establish a sense of safety for ourselves by using our behaviours. Essentially, the picture that you'll see displayed on your screens there are of a variety of different boundaries. And I guess we'll all have a different response to those boundaries at this point. We may see them as positives, we may see them as negatives, we may see them as things that we want or things that we want to avoid. But at this time and in these challenging circumstances, boundaries become something that are important for us. How we begin to boundary and to structure our time becomes increasingly important. Because so often, what we know is that our work routines do so much of our organising for us. Our rhythm of the day is set by balancing our work routine, managing a sense of it's not our Outlook calendar pinging at us, it's this sense that it's taken care of. And yet, when we find ourselves, for many of us, working remotely, for many of us working within different routines, for many of us homeschooling on top of trying to balance our own routines, suddenly things feel less structured. They're less usual to what they've been. And so this next tool is a behavioural tool, based activity scheduling, that can be really simple, but it's a really useful way to begin to boundary our time. Because just like the puppy that I bought 8 years ago now, and when I bought this puppy, I was convinced that the crate that I got for the puppy needed to be the biggest one that I could possibly go, because that would give him the greatest freedom, the greatest ability to move around, and it wouldn't feel contained. And I remember my friend who had looked after dogs from being a child being absolutely appalled and saying, you need a much, much smaller crate for this puppy to feel safe to sleep at night. No wonder he's whining. Why? Because that amount of uncontained space is perceived as being threatening. Now, when we lose the routines that are so often just there for us, we will often find that we lose our sense of safety with regards our day-to-day, and it feels very disconcerting. It can feel as if we kind of lack a structure to it. So the base activity schedule can be used with adults and with children, and it encourages us to focus on just 4 key areas that are really positive for our mental health and well-being, and to plan ahead. The planning ahead is important because the planning ahead gives us something that will structure us for the day ahead, so we've got a sense of something we can follow. We don't have to fill every box, and we're not trying to replicate our usual schedules, particularly with children. Things are different, so allow them to be so. But we need to be able to get a sense that we can control the controllables. And by giving ourselves a framework where we aim to do one thing every day that looks after our body, rest it, exercise it, feed it, let it sleep, gives us one thing each day that gives us a sense of achievement, a job that we can tick off. The brain doesn't know whether we've served world peace or whether we've tidied the sock drawer, but when we draw attention to something that we've done, then it will release the positive chemicals that we need to feel again that we're back in control of the controllables. The third one, connection. Connection, yes, with others, by using a range of different media that's available to us, or good old-fashioned pen and paper, but also perhaps at this time a chance to connect with ourselves, to take advantage of some time, which can be quite confronting, but to take advantage of some time to sit and breathe, quite literally. Sometimes that is enough within challenging circumstances to soothe ourselves whilst the storm rages. And the final one, to do something for pure enjoyment. We'll see when we look at our cognitive response that very often there's a lot of different emotions going on at this point. And actually to allow ourselves to do something simply for the fact that we enjoy it is something that is increasingly important for our mental health and well-being. Because there are necessary restrictions on us at the moment, but psychologically, how we frame these restrictions is crucial to what we do. So on this next slide, we can see that At TalkWorks, particularly given the work that we are able to do with the North East Ambulance Service, we're really aware currently of the necessity of physical distancing. But we also want to be able to continue to promote a social solidarity between us all. We see this in our therapeutic work, the importance for us of still being able to maintain clinical contact with our clients through telephone, through video calls. It's so important that we continue to be united socially at a time when we can't be united physically. So we might need to get creative with what we can do, but that's also a great way to keep our business commitment to innovation going. There's some great local and national initiatives, from the Good Sam Act to more locally based community actions that we can get involved in. Even better, perhaps there's something about what we can spearhead ourselves to be able to use some of this time to think more creatively about what we perhaps can offer that's outside of or out with our ordinary circumstances. And by doing this, we've begun to reground ourselves back in ourselves, but take control of the controllables. We then start to have a starting point to consider how we cognitively approach the challenges that we face. So I'm just going to ask you to have a look at this next slide, if I may. And again, if you wouldn't mind just tapping into the chat box, what do you see when you look at the picture in front of you? What do you see? So rabbit, duck, rabbit and duck, rabbit, duck, seagull, rabbit. There's all sorts, isn't there, here? Rabbit and duck. Okay. From this, just a really, really simple example for us to use is that, yes, some of us will automatically see a duck, perhaps first off, some of the rabbit, some of us perhaps will see both equally in that. And I think that really is the key to how we approach and so suddenly then when we start to have it pointed out, thank you, we see the other. So somehow we see one thing first, and then somebody says something and we're drawn to see something else. And I think this is really where we find ourselves in this position of change, and is that it really is a time for us to see and both. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's have a think. In order to re-establish our sense of safety cognitively, we need to be aware of the ands and boths that we're faced with. So our next section here is that we have to take seriously the reality that our brains can very quickly become overloaded by news about the crisis. We have a need to boundary the amount of exposure that we have to information about it. Certainly we need to be discerning about the quality of information that we're exposing ourselves to, because the amount of exposure will have an impact on our survival mechanism, the amygdala. It will be triggered by the amount that we have. So not just for children, but also for ourselves, we need to be able to boundary that for ourselves. It's another important tool that we have, because it's a controllable that we can take control of. But this can't just be about not informing ourselves or not taking the dangers seriously. It isn't about underestimating the challenges, but in the style of these old-fashioned weighing scales, it's about providing the brain with an alternative neural pathway in order to be able to meet the challenge in a more balanced way. And so the research is out there. Okay, the research is out there in terms of the benefit of finding ways to pay it forward, or to be generous to others. So there's two key ways that can become part of our toolkit that you'll see now, which at first glance might appear a little bit soft and a little bit fluffy around the edges. But I promise you, it's based in hardcore neuropsychology. So the next slide shows us that our two next tools is about really focusing back on ways that we can find to be kind to others. Now, there's been some wonderful stories in and amongst, you know, the tragedies that are also necessarily being reported about kindness to others, whether that's, you know, people going out of their way to look out for neighbours or for more vulnerable people in their communities, or whether it's about people still showing some kind of humour and bringing dance and fancy dress to their post rounds, whatever it might be. There's a sense of this outward looking that goes on. The research would show us that being generous to others doesn't just positively impact on the recipient, but it also benefits the benefactor. It's a little bit like where we started this talk, in terms of the benefit of investing in our employees' and colleagues' mental health and well-being pays off for them, but it also pays off for us. And so a focus can become for us looking for ways in which we can be kind. Because we need to be aware that the brain's natural bias is to highlight negatives. It's how it keeps us safe, by flagging up the problems that will come. And there's plenty of those around at the moment. But what we can also do is some rewiring of the brain, if you like. And this is why it's not soft and fluffy and out there, it's actual hard rewiring of the brain. Because what we know from the research is that if we take time each day to notice positives, to actively notice things that are going well, things that are of beauty, things that have demonstrable benefits, then what we do is we provide an alternative neural pathway to the brain to the one that takes us to the negative each time. We might need to look a bit further and a bit harder, but this is where some of the tools, whether they're physical paper, pen and paper journals, or online apps such as the 5-Minute Journal app, they can help us to really bookend our day with noticing positives and things that we're grateful for. It's why initiatives such as Clap for Our Carers brings together people and leaves people feeling so much more united. So the payback for us, it's not about us not taking dangers seriously, but it's about holding things in a balance by controlling the controllables, by noticing that actually by being kind, by taking the opportunity to be grateful, we induce a chemical response in ourselves, which is the feel-good factor. And that in itself is an important part of us being able to respond to challenge, because it's that feel-good factor that brings us into our final section of this psychological toolkit, which is how we re-establish a sense of safety based on our emotions. So into this final section then, on the next slide, we can't tell someone else or ourselves to feel differently. That's like screaming at someone to relax, and it's totally unhelpful and generally a dead cert to get the opposite response. We've considered things we can do physically, behaviorally, cognitively, and all of these things will have a positive impact on our emotions, because the way we're wired as humans means that an intervention in our physiological state, an intervention in our doing something different, an intervention in terms of us rethinking the way in which we view the world by looking for a positive where we will automatically be drawn to a negative, all of these things can't help but change the way in which we feel. But often, one of the things that we need is actually to get out of our own way and to get out of our own head, to remove shoulds and oughts from our vocabulary around how we emotionally feel at this time, and to actually engage with how it is that we really feel. There's some great resources available to help children to identify their feelings and to be able to communicate them. And as adults, we're not really different, especially at times like this, because times like this tend to confront us with a whole host of difficult and complex emotions. And let's face it, we're uncomfortable with fear, but we tend to be even less comfortable with the idea of love. So what can we do about this? Well, a big challenge when our daily routines are so disrupted is, as we've just mentioned there, is that we start to make unhelpful comparisons. What we would have been doing at this point, what we should have been done, what we should have achieved by now. It pulls us in an unhelpful way towards hypothetical futures and pasts, which Outlook calendars make us all too aware of and are all too readily available to us. And what it can lead to in these unhelpful comparisons that we make is that it can damage our sense of self-esteem and our self-worth. And so the challenge of COVID-19 can often be seen to be a challenge to our identity itself. We need instead to find ways of bringing ourselves and perhaps our colleagues and employees into a place where they can celebrate our own present circumstance, what we are doing in the present, because whatever we've managed to do today, it is absolutely more than enough. The way we talk to ourselves, one of my favorites for the minute, I'm doing the best I can do with what I've got. And that might be physical resource and it might be emotional resource, but we're doing the best that we can do. But the way that we talk to ourselves is increasingly important. If we can't imagine saying it to a friend, don't say it to ourselves. Because we're not going to be super parents, employee of the year, domestic gods and goddesses, the new Joe Wicks or Kelly Holmes, not all on one day at the very least. We need to be able to talk to ourselves in ways that encourages us to accept we are in challenging times. And before this feels like we might run the risk of taking ourselves just too seriously, let's remember that humour has to play a big part in our response to the challenge. Even the Queen mentioned that in her speech. Humour isn't to be insensitive to the real tragedies and losses being experienced as a result of COVID-19. But in sensitive ways, humour is a way in which we can keep ourselves grounded. We can only laugh in the present moment. And by doing so, we can get some relief from it. Because keeping grounded in this way is vital for our response and our psychological response to the challenges. So in conclusion, these are unprecedented times that we live in. They really do present both danger and, yes, also there are opportunities to be had. It really is the and both. And the and both is that we need to be able to take ourselves as humans in a holistic sense. We hope that we've been able to provide just some practical strategies for you to help meet the challenges we face, both physically, behaviourally, cognitively, and emotionally, because we must be real about the challenges. The challenges are real. These are uncertain times, but our job is for us to focus on creating this sense of safety for ourselves. There's been a lot of talk on the media just recently about the language that we use. And I think just in conclusion, I'm going to show you a tweet from Dr. Ian Laurie. I think he'll just appear on this next slide. What I love about Ian Laurie is that he notes exactly that none of us are okay at this point. Whatever our role, whatever our circumstance, this is challenging. These are challenging times. And so none of us are okay, but together we can meet the challenges because it is good to talk. Talk works. And so I open it up now for any questions that you might have, whilst just providing a reminder on this final slide that you are more than welcome to get in touch with us. We're very happy to provide a copy of our top 10 tips for meeting the challenge, some of which we've mentioned in this talk here, and further signposting through to helpful resources that we would recommend in order that together we continue to meet the challenges that are here and are now. So do feel free to send us an email, and I will now open it up for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Really important to say it was practical, structured, and a lot of good ideas. On the call, we've got a real range of people joining us. So we've got people, we've got operators, we've got business owners. The question from me would be: we've recorded this. Can we send this out?
Yes. So
send it to their staff.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that would be good, because I think a lot of people on the call will think it's very thought-provoking, and as you said, it's the right time for us to be having these discussions.
I think.
Okay. If anybody else wants to ask, tap on the bottom. Yeah, we'll see participants, and you can just click on yourself, and it will put your hand up, and you can ask a question. I don't know if you can see that, Claudia.
Yes.
Anybody asking their hand?
There's no raised hands at the moment.
click on yourself, and you would put, it would say raise hand if you want to ask a question. You just click on that, it'll just having a look through.
Yeah, I think, Ian, just coming back to what you were saying, that the more people that we can just talk to about this, you know, what we've done there is just select out some ways of meeting these challenges. And really the challenge for us all is just keeping this conversation going. You know, we're all learning as we go along with this one. And so certainly from TalkWorks, we'll be making sure that we make it available as well, you know, in terms of being able to share the information that we've got in terms of equipping each other to be able to meet the challenges that are there in as many ways as we can.
That's great. I think the other thing that we probably would think of is we don't know how long this lockdown period is going to be. Obviously, we can guess, but I think it's a topic that we as a forum probably want to address again. And so we'll talk to you to see if there's anything else, you know, we can do, you know, because I'm guessing as the lockdown goes on, people's sort of frame of mind will change from positives to negatives and back up again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a dynamic situation, Ian, and it is something that will require different responses as those circumstances change around us. So it totally is going to be one in which we need to keep equipping ourselves for what happens next, because you're totally right, depending on how long something goes on for, it requires different skills from us. It's that same sense. I know we've talked about this, it's been used a lot, hasn't it, that our response is a marathon, not a sprint. But of course, even within a marathon race, there's such a different number of techniques and strategies that we can use. So absolutely, as time goes on, we're going to keep updating kind of our recommendations as we go along. We're also really aware that, you know, depending on different circumstances will also depend slightly in terms of the response that we make. So for frontline staff, our advice and our recommendations will be different for people who are grappling primarily with remote working, because these are different challenges that come to us from, and this is the complexity of the situation, is different challenges that come to us from this one kind of presentation. Yeah.